Hey guys, it's towniesimbuilds here, and welcome back to another episode of The Sims 4 Real Lore. In this series, we explore interesting destinations from around the world, shrouded in history, mystery, and sometimes a little bit of spookiness. Today's episode uncovers the interesting yet turbulent past of Sheffield Lighthouse, a New England lighthouse that has been in existence for almost 200 years. Through the past 2 centuries, the Sheffield Lighthouse has survived the American Civil War, one of the worst US maritime tragedies, the Prohibition era, and several failed attempts to transform its location into a luxury resort. Most curiously, however, the lighthouse is rumored to be haunted, in fact by 3 different ghostly presences that do haunt the old beacon to this very day. Now, as a quick note before diving into today's video, the history of Sheffield Lighthouse was very difficult to research, as there were a lot of different sources with overlapping dates, names, events, and even conflicting information. The timeline and facts presented in this episode are my very best collective summary of all of these articles, so I do apologize if some information may vary if you do wish to do your own research on Sheffield Lighthouse itself. On another note, this episode will also discuss matters regarding the supernatural and paranormal, so please keep that in mind while watching. Starting off our tale today, the Sheffield Lighthouse is located in the Connecticut town of Norwalk, located in the United States. The lighthouse itself is situated at the town's southernmost tip on an island known as Sheffield Island. During the time of the lighthouse's operation, the city of Norwalk thrived as a center of manufacturing and oystering, given the town's location on the Atlantic coast. Sheffield Island itself would be a very rich part of Norwalk's history, from the colonial era through the Industrial Revolution. Centuries prior to the lighthouse's construction, the island was originally owned by a Norwalk Native American chief named 𝗪𝗏, who, based on reports, gifted the land to a reverend and schoolteacher by the name of Thomas Hanford on December 2nd, 1690. Prior to this transaction, the island had actually been frequented by local tribes, with one particular tribe known as the 𝗪𝗔𝗧𝗖𝗛𝗡𝗚. According to the Norwalk Seaport Association, the 𝗪𝗪𝗧𝗖𝗛 formerly inhabited the island in snail-shaped homes. They constructed these homes using natural materials found on Sheffield Island, while also surviving on the sea life that the surrounding water provided. Now, unfortunately, due to the lack of documentation over the next century, the owners succeeding Thomas Hanford would be unknown. For a period of 12 years, the island had been privately owned, before eventually becoming community property and then reverting back to private land not long after. Recorded ownership finally reappeared in the year of 1804, when the island was purchased by former Revolutionary War captain Robert Sheffield, whom the island is now named after today. However, not long after in 1826, Sheffield would then sell the land to his son-in-law Gershom Smith. Historically speaking, many regard Gershom Smith to be the very first keeper of the soon-to-be-developed Sheffield Island Lighthouse. In the time leading up to the lighthouse's development, sources state that Gershom had sold Sheffield Island to the US government. At this time, the US Treasury Department was responsible for seeking new lighthouse locations across the country, and upon seeing Sheffield Island, likely contacted Gershom to purchase this land. Construction of Sheffield Lighthouse began in 1827 and would then be completed in the year of 1828. Now, despite being sold to the government, Gershom Smith would retain his title as the lighthouse's first keeper, and as a result would service the lighthouse for a period of almost 20 years, living there with his wife and raising a large family of 12 children. The lighthouse served its purpose, being a guide to passing ships. However, it also drew quite a crowd thanks to Gershom's business pursuits. According to reports, Gershom eventually opened a hotel on Sheffield Island, offering what will be known as a house of entertainment. An old article from a local newspaper clipping indicates that this destination would be an ideal location for parties, libations, and water excursions for years to come. In fact, Gershom Smith and his family would inhabit the island for a total of 5 generations, operating their business while also tending to cattle on the island as well, who would graze about Sheffield Island and surrounding areas. Unfortunately, under Gershom Smith's operation, Sheffield Island would witness a horrific maritime disaster 14 years after its construction. On January 13, 1840, a steamship known as the Lexington had been traveling from New York City to the direction of Boston, carrying about 140 passengers and a large cargo of cotton bales. At approximately 7 p.m. that evening with temperatures below freezing, the Lexington actually caught fire as it approached Sheffield Lighthouse. Based on accounts from survivors, the cotton bales that were loaded onto the aft deck of the ship were placed in dangerous proximity to the ship's smokestacks, which quickly became both the source and fuel of the blaze. Unfortunately, the fire spread very quickly throughout the ship, while also preventing any crew members from slowing down the speeding vessel. As a result, lifeboats capsized, and unfortunately for nearly all those on board, their lives either ended in the flames of the Lexington itself, or within the freezing waters of the Atlantic. Approximately out of the 140 to 150 lives on board, only 4 individuals made it out alive. Now, I do want to note that this particular tragedy may account for some mysterious occurrences at Sheffield Lighthouse, but we will get into that a little later on in this video. Fortunately for 𝗪𝗓𝗓 and his family, they were in fact safe from this disaster. However, strangely enough, I wasn't able to find any commentary or eyewitness accounts from 𝗪𝗓𝗓 himself regarding this very tragic event, despite the Lexington disaster occurring from the view of the lighthouse itself. Despite this, 𝗪𝗓𝗓 would pass away in the year of 1845, only 5 years after the Lexington tragedy. This would then transition ownership to a man named 𝗪𝗧𝗛𝗏𝗏𝗡𝗚. Now, based on a local inspection report of the lighthouse's condition, unfortunately, 𝗪𝗧𝗏𝗏𝗡𝗚 had struggled to upkeep the lighthouse itself. The report indicated that there were several areas of the property that were in very bad disrepair. Unfortunately, this would then transition the lighthouse into a period of both positive and negative change. Following the death of Gershom Smith, Sheffield Lighthouse would unfortunately suffer extensive damages throughout its existence, primarily due to natural disasters. Reportedly, in the same year Gershom Smith died, a heavy 2-day storm impacted Sheffield Island and the surrounding islands south of Norwalk, eroding a lot of the coastal lines. The Sheffield Lighthouse was impacted by this event, with many sources indicating that the original lighthouse tower had become almost completely submerged in water. The original 1826 lighthouse keeper's house, a small stone cottage at the back of the property, still stands on Sheffield Island to this day. The new Victorian-style lighthouse pictured throughout this episode was constructed in the year of 1868. Overall, it does remain mostly unchanged, but it did require extensive repairs, especially after the impacts of hurricanes throughout the 1900s and even the 2000s. Despite the early success of Sheffield Island and the lighthouse itself, Sheffield Island would cease to operate in the year of 1902, more than 70 years after its original inception. Unfortunately, as maritime traffic increased in the surrounding waters, sailors were finding Sheffield Lighthouse to be less and less reliable, claiming that the lighthouse's beam was difficult to see given the height of the lighthouse itself. The dullness of its light was another factor, which may have been due to the outdated light fixtures from decades prior. As a result, Congress allocated funds for the construction of Green's Ledge Lighthouse, located less than a mile away west of Sheffield Island. Unfortunately, for a period of 12 years, the lighthouse would fall into a very murky state, being used for questionable purposes. Reports state that the lighthouse was a literal beacon for criminal activity. Ultimately, it became a common meeting spot for wealthy individuals to negotiate shady business transactions. Most notably, however, was the use of Sheffield Lighthouse during the time of Prohibition. Prohibition in the United States, which lasted between 1920 and 1933, prohibited the manufacture, transport, and selling of alcohol throughout the nation. However, as time will tell, this law did not stop any eager consumers and businesses. During the times of Prohibition, the island's very secluded location made it an ideal spot for smuggling alcohol. It allowed for illegal tradesmen, known as rum runners, to use the lighthouse as a sort of hidden business spot. Apart from that, the lighthouse was also likely used as a rest stop, as rum runners navigated the waters of the US, covertly moving their products. Apart from the illegal activities regarding Sheffield Lighthouse, there were also many reports of efforts to transform the island into a full-on opulent recreational destination, with plans that may or may not have included Sheffield Lighthouse within its ambitions. As a brief overview, the lighthouse would then pass through several more owners, including Norwalk Yacht Club captain 𝗪𝗏𝗏𝗚𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏𝗏 A man by the name of Robert L. Corby would then become owner of a lavish mansion that formerly existed on the corner of the island, who reportedly attempted to turn the island into a full-on country club-style resort. Plans for the resort itself were quite grandiose, intending to feature golf, tennis, polo horse stables, and even a landing strip for small private planes. While there were efforts to launch this development in the 1930s, reports state that due to the lack of freshwater access, the plans were ultimately rejected in the year of 1937. Other reports, however, counter this claim, stating that the country club thrived for a long period of time, attracting wealthy and high-status patrons from both the United States and overseas. However, it was ultimately shut down in 1937 due to destruction from New England storms. Despite these setbacks, the 𝗪𝗏 family would hold ownership of the lighthouse until the 1980s. The Norwalk Seaport Association would purchase Sheffield Lighthouse along with the Old Keeper's Cottage at the back of the property. After extensive refurbishing efforts, the association would then transition the lighthouse into a full-on National Historic Site in the year of 1989. Despite the bustling activity surrounding the lighthouse's history, there have been some very mysterious discrepancies regarding the deaths of its keepers. Some sources state that a man by the name of Noah Mosher had been keeper of the Sheffield Lighthouse. He became keeper in 1861, before eventually passing away on July of 1872. However, based on accounts recorded in an unnamed local newspaper, there were claims that Noah died under very odd circumstances. Reports state that Noah had been in Sheffield Lighthouse, watching vessels pass by, seated with his spyglass in hand. Allegedly, Noah was conversing with an unknown companion who witnessed Noah suddenly fall backwards in his chair and die. Despite this claim, some sources state that the death described by this article actually occurred 100 years later in 1972, describing the death of an original yet unnamed lighthouse keeper. However, it is likely that Mosher was the keeper linked to this strange death, given that he was one of the first 3 owners prior to the turn of the 20th century. His son would then take over his duties as lighthouse keeper for a period of roughly 6 years, followed by the last 3 lighthouse keepers up until 1902. These included Frederick Comstock, Neil Ward, and Samuel Arbor, respectively. The date of Mosher's death, 1872, is likely to have been misconstrued as 1972, a date much too far ahead in the lighthouse's history, and therefore beyond the lifespan of any of the first 3 original keepers. Some sources propose that this death may have described the passing of Gershom Smith. However, this theory has arguably the weakest correlation and the weakest validity of the 3 potential keepers, with other sources suggesting the original purchaser of the island, Captain Robert Sheffield, to be the individual who suffered this very strange, mysterious death. Among the earliest witnesses of eerie paranormal activity was Karen Orosky, an archaeologist who was making her way to Sheffield Island via boat. While approaching the island, Karen reported hearing, quote, hypnotic and mystical music that seemed to emanate from the island itself. However, there was no clear source for the music in sight. Apart from that, she was also able to hear what sounded like a foghorn, despite foghorns not being existent on the island, along with an unknown voice or voices calling out for help in the vicinity of the island. Some sources allocate these creepy sounds to Captain Robert Sheffield, the namesake owner of Sheffield Island. The music heard by Karen reportedly may have resembled a musical instrument known as a long spell, which Robert Sheffield was rumored to own and play. The instrument was said to resemble a large violin, played with porcupine quills in place of the traditional string bow. Unfortunately, after doing more research, I was not able to locate any instrument known as a long spell, nor was I able to find a photograph of the instrument itself. Despite Karen's experiences having a possible connection to Robert Sheffield, there are also signs that point to yet another haunting possibility. The proximity of the island to the 1840 Lexington tragedy does provide a possible source for ghostly phenomenon. With that said, signs of paranormal activity could stem from the many passengers who unfortunately lost their lives that night, with their cries for help reflecting the tragic events that did in fact unfold. Apart from this, however, there are also reports from paranormal investigators stating that the ghost of a mysterious young girl also dwells within the land of Sheffield Lighthouse. Supporting this claim is the extensive investigations led by paranormal expert Christine Kaczynski, founder of Connecticut Paranormal Research and Investigations. Based on reports, Christine has been researching the paranormal for a span of multiple decades, conducting in-person investigations in alleged haunted locations, both within and outside of the US. Collectively, she has been featured in various nationally syndicated documentaries produced by ABC and NBC respectively, along with popular television shows including Unsolved Mysteries and The World's Scariest Places. Based on Christine's investigations of Sheffield Lighthouse, the young girl identifies herself as Abigail and is said to be around 6 to 7 years of age at the time of her death. Unfortunately, both the year of her death and the cause of her death are unknown. However, Christine did manage to uncover some very unsettling information about Abigail's presence based on reported communication with her spirit. Christine 𝗧𝗏𝗡𝗚 quotes, "I have no idea who Abby may be. She is bound to the lighthouse and she doesn't seem to be able to make her way out of there because of the two other spirits." Furthering this statement, Christine states that the two older adult spirits are somehow keeping Abigail's spirit trapped within the lighthouse itself. Abigail can leave the confines of the lighthouse, but only under very rare instances, allowing her to traverse the surrounding beach area. Ominously, Christine also states that these two adult spirits tend to, quote, wreak havoc within the lighthouse. However, the exact meaning of this description is not specified. We're not sure if they are involved in some kind of ongoing altercation, nor do we know the exact reasons as to why there is this tension, or how it even manifests within the lighthouse. Unfortunately, based on Christine's investigations, we are also unable to learn the names of these two other spirits. There is a possibility that these spirits could have been Abigail's parents or guardians, but unfortunately there is no evidence supporting this particular theory. In terms of overall paranormal activity, however, there were some very eerie fluctuations that the Connecticut Paranormal Research and Investigations did in fact report. The team of approximately 18 to 19 individuals conducted their investigation at Sheffield Lighthouse in July of 2006. Reportedly, a temperature reading of 25 degrees Fahrenheit was recorded in the second story of Sheffield Lighthouse, a very substantial drop from the 65 to 70 degrees that evening in the summer of July that year. This was also accompanied by very large spikes in the team's tri-field meter, which indicated odd and sudden fluctuations in the room's electromagnetic fields. Based on her contact with Abigail and the other spirits in the house, with the exception of the two adults mentioned prior, the spirits did seem friendly and benevolent according to Christine, with no signs of ill intent or negative energy. While traditionally being common indicators of ghostly or spiritual presences in the paranormal field, these reports have been met with much skepticism. Sheffield Island manager Mark Schlegel, a member of the Norwalk Seaport Association since 1978, countered Christine's findings. He claimed to have never encountered any ghostly or paranormal activity in all the years he has been within the lighthouse. Professional magician James Randi also denounced Christine's claims, who in many reports questioned Christine's methods of communicating with Abigail's ghost and in fact obtaining her name. Now, upon being questioned, Christine claimed that she was able to obtain both Abigail's name and story on a, quote, intuitive level. However, there is not certain confirmation if Christine possessed any spiritual abilities that would have allowed her to obtain this information. From my research, unfortunately, there are also no videos or photographs depicting possible apparitions of any of these three different spirits. To this day, the reported ghostly activity of Sheffield Lighthouse remains a true mystery. Karen Orosky's experiences of a ghostly lighthouse keeper leave us with no confirmed identity. Likewise, Christine 𝗧𝗏𝗡𝗚𝗚's investigations of Abigail and the two adult spirits confining her leave us with more questions than we have answers. Were all of these spirits former inhabitants of the lighthouse, or the island itself? Or did Sheffield Island become a refuge, an eerie beacon for the lives lost on the Lexington, almost 200 years ago? Alternatively, is the Sheffield Lighthouse even haunted? Today, regardless of whether or not these hauntings are true, the Sheffield Lighthouse pays homage to its fascinating past and folklore. One of its more modern-day traditions is a spooky Halloween event for children, held every October, transforming the lighthouse into a fun haunted house attraction. Year-round, the Sheffield Lighthouse, as it is now a preserved historical location, also offers guided tours, exploring the inside of the lighthouse itself, while providing more information regarding its history. If you do in fact decide to embark on this tour, you also get to enjoy a ferry boat ride to and from the island itself. Alright guys, and that is a wrap on the interesting past and supposed hauntings of the Sheffield Island Lighthouse. As always, I hope you guys enjoyed learning about the lore and watching the full speed build come to life. As a quick note, I do believe I got the exterior fairly close, but there was a very limited array of images regarding the inside of the lighthouse, so a lot of the areas you see are of my own creation. Just like always, this is still a no CC, no mod limited pack build, and will be available on the Sims 4 gallery as well. And with that said, this has been towniesimbuilds signing off. Thank you so much for watching, guys.